Coming up in this episode.
What I've seen is that kids, in particular, are very media literate. They understand it very well. They display all the signs of knowing it. They're very thorough fact checkers, but it's exhausting. Every minute you spend on these platforms, your brain is working harder than it would have done in the past to do, to watch a film or to watch, a TV show or read a book. The flip side of that, of course, is that because you're constantly stimulated, you think that's how you're supposed to be in your downtime. This is my plea in particular to policymakers, to civil servants, to government, but also to the advertising industry itself. Everyone needs a better understanding and to get a better handle on how this works, how it's changing, and what those changes will mean for people's relationship with media and with communications.
So we made it to episode 2, Claire.
We're here.
We're here. Hello, everybody. And look, it's a delight. And thank you so much for all the many kind comments we've had, because we've had lots of kind comments, haven't we?
We have an incredible amount. Thank you. This does seem to have touched a nerve with people in a way, I didn't expect.
Yeah, I think so. It's been amazing. And look, we're absolutely delighted, I think. And so hopefully episode 2 will be as joyous as episode 1 was. So let's start, shall we, Claire? Firstly, a reminder, if you want to get in touch with us on the email, I got it wrong last episode. I'm going to try and get it right this episode.
We both got it wrong last episode.
Yeah, that wasn't a good start. Can we have your attention at protonmail.com? Can we have your attention at protonmail.com? Right, Claire, let us then today talk about how these companies grab our attention and try to keep it. Okay, so let's just start with that. What are they trying to do?
So, it's exactly as you say. I think the first thing that's worth setting up right away is that, we're going to talk a little bit about how, particularly digital and online life, it does seem to take up a vast proportion of your attention, maybe whether you intend it to or not. And I think sometimes these conversations end up veering into conspiracy theory almost, or assuming that there's malign intent behind it. And occasionally emails are pulled up or things come to light that suggest that they are malicious, but actually they're not, right? I think the first thing to understand is that these companies are operating at a scale of, it's a planetary scale, right? So when they say things like, yes, our chatbot will interact with a child, they don't actually mean that that's a good thing. And they don't think that that's not a problem. What they're saying is that when you have billions of users, you can't account for all the things that will go wrong. You have to be aware of it, but that you shouldn't always proceed with something because there's always a risk to it. You wouldn't expect a laundry detergent company to stop producing laundry detergent liquid just because someone drinks it once, but it doesn't mean they stop producing something that helps you live your life. So I think, when we think about these companies, the thing we have to think about, first of all, is they're operating at these huge scales, and they do genuinely believe that people get some value from it. Whether or not we agree with that is another thing altogether. But for them and for most people who interact with these platforms, you do get some value from it. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't, right?
Yeah, and look, for all of these conversations we've been having about the terrible things that attention can do to us, actually this comes back to the real crux of the problem as I see it, which is that we like these things, right? These things like Facebook, like Twitter, or old Twitter. You remember when you used to be on that? Good fun. Blue Sky, all of those things, right? Yes, okay, there is an element of which they are designed to keep our attention, but we like them as humans.
We do. And I think attention is not something you can stop having, right? To be paying attention or to have attention is to be alive and functioning. So that's kind of the problem that we face. Maybe it's a bit more like obesity, where if you're struggling with it, one of the struggles is you can't just stop eating. That's not an option. So changing your relationship to that and changing what you want from it requires something that's much harder to do, because you can't live without eating. And this is that plus, because there is no minute of your day that you can't have your attention switched on. It is not an option. You can work out ways to manage it, to live with it, to understand it, to be aware of it, but you cannot not have attention.
I think, well, the other thing is, of course, that with things like weight, for example, I mean, I'm somebody who's struggled with my weight my whole life. And actually, I think one of the things about weight that makes it a lot easier to deal with than attention is that you can see it. Right? Yeah. I mean, it's obvious when you feel a bit kind of bigger and you look at yourself in your mirror and you look a bit bigger and you're like, okay, that's a problem. You don't actually notice as much, do you, when you've got a problem with attention, because it's just not as apparent.
Yeah. I mean, if it were easy, meditating would be easy. And as anyone who's tried meditation knows, it's really hard because your brain wants to wander off. It wants to think. It's part of being alive. And those distraction mechanisms that your brain has are survival mechanisms, right? Chris Hayes, in his book, The Siren's Call, talks about this in a really great way. He talks about 3 forms of attention, but the one that's involuntary and the one that's, he calls social attention, both of those things are survival mechanisms. Involuntary attention is being aware of something, of your general environment, so you're not accidentally mowed down by something, right?
Yeah.
It can't always distinguish between things that are a threat and things that are just background noise. But that's sort of the point, because those things sound the same. And for social attention, being aware of what people are saying or doing is part of being part of a community or part of life. You need people to survive. So being socially aware, even when you don't want to be, is part of that. And those 2 mechanisms are the ones that you both cannot control, but also the ones that are tapped into the most by the attention economy. So I think it's worth talking about these things because you not just have to accept them, but be aware of them so you can incorporate them into your life and maybe be not just a bit more forgiving of yourself for what you're doing, but maybe be able to feel like a better sense of control of what you're doing during the day.
So let's talk a bit about then how these companies are literally, what do they do? I know it makes them sound like terrible tech overlords, but
and they're not, I promise.
Questionable, right? But what do they do to grab our attention?
So the first thing to say about these companies, aside from all the things I just said about them not being evil, is that, if we think about them individually, they've each developed a product that filled a massive gap in people's lives or addressed a need that people didn't even know they had. And now we think of as almost a human right? So, but then their success was judged on how much they met that need, but there was no ceiling on what that need was. So the way that they do it is, these are computer scientists, these are programmers, and they're attuned to look for subtle changes in user behavior. And they use that word really deliberately. It's the user of the product, of the service. They don't think about this in terms of marketing. They don't think about it in terms of sociology. It is user behavior and interactions. And if they see changes in those behaviors with those products, they look for what that change is indicating or what it's going towards, and they adapt it. And the things they look for depend on the platform that you're using. So if you're running a giant search tool, let's say you're Google, for example, you might be noticing changes in the kinds of things that people are searching for. We talked in the first episode about Google having been founded, James, when we started university. And those early searches were things like flights, like very simple
okay, really simple stuff.
And then eventually they evolved to, more complex things. One of the early ones was searches for diseases because, a lot of early entries onto the internet were scientists sharing papers and sharing work. And then it started to be questions about, why is my boyfriend being this way? Why does my girlfriend act this way? Much more nuanced things once you got the hang of it. So here's an anecdotal example. Over 10 years ago, I worked on a product with a big hair care company, and they worked with YouTube. It was an outlet where we worked with a lot of what at the time we called beauty bloggers, and now we call influencers, to answer questions about hair. But the way it came up was that one of the creative directors on it could see that there were massive changes in the way that people searched for different kinds of hair things. She could see that there were seasonal trends, that there were geographic differences, but she could also see that there were changes as well in the kinds of things that people were asking for. One of the things that we learned through the course of that as well is that the algorithm isn't something that's set and then carries on. quite often.
Yeah, it's constant iteration,
it's
right?
Constant
it's
iteration.
constantly improving.
Hundreds of iterations every year, right? Hundreds of tweaks being made every year to this particular algorithm to account for the way that people want to use search and what they're trying to use it for. And that has, consequences both for us. It makes the product better for us or able to better address our needs. But what it also does is it keeps us engaged in it. And the more that we see it giving us the answers to the questions that we're asking, the more likely we are to return to it.
One of the things that I find really interesting is the idea that the people working in these companies are not they are computer programmers, but they're almost human behavior specialists, right?
Yeah.
That's what they're leaning into.
Initially it was unwittingly, right? So in 2011 or 2012, when Facebook at the time, so maybe better now, but Facebook at the time first came to London, set up their office. At the time, I think they had something like 2,000 employees globally. Can you imagine? Okay. To put that in perspective, so Facebook had 2,000 employees globally. At the time, PricewaterhouseCoopers, or PwC, had 10,000 employees in the UK. So that's...
Yeah. I mean, just to give you an idea, Meta, I think I've done a very quick Google search, so I'm not saying this is absolutely accurate, but it's something like 76,000 worldwide.
Yeah, that checks out. Yeah. So 2000, and they said, I don't know how we do with more. We think that's, it's a lot of people. So they were very stretched, very thin, but they were coming to the UK, setting up an office and let's say a stronger advertising proposition. They wanted to take more of a share of TV budget at the time. That felt very ambitious if you worked in advertising. Like you couldn't imagine them taking 10% of TV budget. Now it's, But anyway, I went to an event and the keynote speaker was Andrew Bosworth, who is now their chief technical officer. He says what he thinks. He doesn't sugarcoat it. And a marketer in the audience for a relatively large company asked a question, basically expressing a frustration that Facebook changed their algorithms. And whenever they changed their algorithms, it would upend a marketing operation completely. And Andrew Bosworth went on a little bit of a rant, but said, look, people are changing faster than we at Facebook can keep up with. We're just trying everything we can to keep up with all these changing behaviors. So we have to constantly make adjustments to the algorithm to keep up with the pace at which people change. And if we're struggling to keep up with it, and you're telling me that you're struggling to keep up with us, then you know what? You're welcome. Basically.
Well, it's interesting though, isn't it? Because a lot of what I think we're talking about here, we're talking about changes in society. And one of the changes is that previously we had this concept that people didn't really change a lot. Would change over a generation, but they wouldn't change within a month.
And
now that was probably never really true.
Yeah,
I was going to say that probably wasn't ever true in terms of people have always changed their minds on a regular basis. I think the difference now is that because we have individual social media accounts and so on, that those changes individually can be mapped much more effectively. Yeah. And so what I mean is when you're looking at firms like advertising firms, for example, the ground has completely shifted for them because previously they could rely on, in the UK, we had things like Mondeo Man, right? The concept that a certain type of person drove a Ford Mondeo. But actually, that doesn't really exist anymore. And those people who might be Mondeo Man one week are suddenly buying an EV next week and it's completely different.
Oh, I remember, when we were saying it was BMW 3 Series Man and 20 Mondeo Man.
Right, okay. Yeah. But those whole concepts on which things like advertising are based have just completely changed.
Well, it's funny because Mondeo Man was a political segmentation, right? Yeah. It was a political segment. Okay, so I think the one thing to say is that people have more in common than they don't, right? Like physiologically, we're pretty much the same. And that goes everywhere in the world, right? And our underlying needs and motivations are pretty much the same. We need food, water, shelter, but also, almost everyone in the world loves their mom and dad or wants to love their mom and dad, right? Yeah. If you're parents, you want to love your children or you do love your children. You care about them. You care about what's happening in your community. You feel empathy for people who are sad or going through a difficult time. You want to connect with people. You want to feel a sense of belonging. That is universal and that has not changed. But I think when we look at behaviors and what we expect from our lives. When we feel like something's improved, we want that improvement to stay. And we also want to feel a sense of progression. And so, as we're talking about this, and it's really just as we're talking about it, I think in the advertising industry as well, there's clinging on to the hope that people don't change. And they're right, the fundamentals of people don't change, but their behaviors and expectations certainly do. And that's what Facebook noticed in its early days, and that's what Google certainly noticed, and all tech companies who have a big engineering base that is exposed to the minutiae of human behavior on its platforms every day.
We are at some point hopefully going to speak to people from social media companies and get a better idea of that algorithm.
Love that, but we'll probably have to get
people who've previously been in them might happen.
Yeah.
I mean, the point is, how do you keep the attention? It's all about that algorithm. It's about the constant iterations of that algorithm.
Yes, very much, yeah. And the reason that happens is because ultimately, from the very beginning, the attraction of these companies from the city or from, Wall Street, if you're, listed in the US, was their ability to attract and retain users. And all of their metrics are assessed on that. So if we go back to 2012 and look at the IPO for Facebook, for example, you can see that the main driver of that was growth in users. Well, now they've basically maxed out their user growth, right? They've acquired the main companies that either pose a threat, in Instagram's case, or were able to provide another kind of user base. And now the way that they're assessed is on how much time people spend on the platforms and how much ad revenue they're able to generate as a result. Now, there's a ceiling on how much time someone can spend on the platform because there are but 24 hours in a day. But one of the ways that they figured out how to maximize ad revenue and also maybe keep people in is to change how much content flows through that platform in that amount of time. So for Meta in particular, I think videos have gotten shorter. There's a lot more content going through it, and that's corresponded to an increase in ad revenue. That might be correlation rather than causation, but those things are interlinked. And I've noticed in the last quarter, they talked about, in particular, the amount of time, the growth in video viewing time spent on the platform, which is, part of it is addressing the skepticism from the city, I think, that are they going to win those minutes from TikTok? Or will TikTok take that off them? But if you just zoom back and look at it from a very human angle, what you can see is that they are very focused on keeping users engaged. And what that means is time spent.
So Claire, we've leaned into this a little bit already, but who wants our attention? The social media companies only or other people? And why are they doing it? Is it all just about money?
So for social media companies and for digital companies generally, I mean, yes, they do want your attention. So that is fundamentally how their businesses are valued. That may change with AI, how we qualify what attention is, may change, but, human attention is basically how that's measured at the moment. And that's because the vast majority of its revenue comes from advertising. So Google, 90% of its revenue comes from advertising. The other 10% is made up of things like subscriptions to Google Workspace, for example.
Yep.
But for Meta, it's 98.7%, I believe. I'll double check it.
Wow.
But it's over 98%, right?
So it's basically an advertising company.
It's basically an advertising company. Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Hence, you can see the push to try to incorporate advertising into WhatsApp. But the vast majority of Meta's revenue, including Facebook, Instagram, et cetera, comes from advertising. Now, if you're a brand or a business advertising anything, you probably have some digital and social built into your campaign plans, right? And the bigger the brand you are generally, the more advertising spend you have, the more diverse your campaign plans are. But a substantial portion of that revenue will come directly from small and medium-sized enterprises who spend a bigger proportion of their smaller budgets on digital and social spending. So
you're talking about mom and pop shops, your local business, basically.
Yeah, but it can also be, medium businesses are in that definition as well. So medium business can be a business that has, maybe 100 or 500 employees. It can be, something that makes a couple £1 million a year in revenue or even more than that. And they're often thinking much more about targeted marketing. So that massive proportion of revenue coming from advertising means they need to demonstrate metrics that advertisers value. And that can be different depending on the type of advertiser that you are. Bear with me here.
No, I'm bearing. Carry on.
You're bearing. So if we think about, say, traditional TV advertising, at least from the UK perspective, there's something that we tended to want to see in TV ads, and that's actually the brain not working that hard. So,
okay, can you explain that? What do you mean by that?
Okay, so advancements in neuroscience, and particularly using neuroscience for ad testing, have helped us visualize this a bit better. On one side, you have a brain that, isn't very lit up. And on the other side, you have a brain that is lit up like a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
Now, the funny thing is the brain that's lit up like a Christmas tree, if you're evaluating a television ad in particular, you don't want that to happen because it means the brain is working too hard and it's not going to remember anything. When the brain's
right, it's not that the brain is concentrating on the advert, it's that the brain is concentrating on other things.
No, it's concentrating too hard on the ad. So if you're making the brain work too hard, it won't absorb the information. It's like, do you remember that thing at uni where when you were preparing for an exam, there was the advice was
I didn't do any exams at uni.
You didn't do any exams?
No, I only chose a course that didn't involve exams because I hated exams so much. But anyway, you carry on with your excellent anecdote.
Yeah, okay, so if you remember preparing for an exam, your teachers would always advise you to never cram because cramming, you'd have that very short-term retention of information and then it would immediately disappear. And so if you just operated like that on a cycle, you were never really going to learn anything. And what they were describing was memory.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that as a TV advertiser, what you are looking for is for people to take in your story, your brand information.
Yeah.
Probably over a period of time rather than...
Over a period of time, and it helps
so it's not
enjoying it.
So in other words, it's not that you are wanting them to see one thing from that company and take it in immediately and act on it.
Yeah.
You're talking about brand recognition rather than an individual advert saying, hey, I've got to go and buy that thing.
Exactly. And that builds over time. So there's another book I recommend almost everyone who touches advertising reads called How Brands Grow. And I once heard someone in advertising joke that it should be called How Big Brands Get Big and Stay Big.
Right, okay.
Because you just have inbuilt advantages of that. Like that accumulates over time. Memory accumulates. But the thing that helps it get there is the slow build of the memory. However, what that doesn't do is help your short-term sales. From a technical standpoint, if you're working in advertising and trying to work to help brands grow, you have to get that balance right between things that will drive short-term sales so that you keep getting money in the bank, but building that brand in the long term and getting that right. But if you're a small or medium enterprise, one, you don't have the resources to do that. Two, you also don't have anyone telling you to do that. And three, you're much more clear on maybe what your product is or your service is, but maybe not necessarily how to entertain, cajole, persuade to get you there. So advertising like that just tends to be a bit harder. It tends to throw a lot of information at you very quickly to tell you all the things it does. And the people receiving that information, your customers, their brains work harder to do that. That's sort of the way that these platforms function now. Every piece of content is very short, very condensed to get a lot in a very short space of time, and is pummeling a lot of information at you quickly. So every minute you spend on these platforms, your brain is working harder than it would have done in the past, to watch a film or to watch, a TV show or read a book. The flip side of that, of course, is that because you're constantly stimulated, you think that's how you're supposed to be in your downtime. So everything does feel slower and a bit more boring. And then it becomes harder to do. And so you're in this trap where your brain is working too hard and you hate the way that makes you feel. But at the same time, everything else feels too slow and you don't know how to deal with it anymore. I think there's now a lot more access to advertising by lots of different people, right? So in the past, there was a very high bar to advertising at a mass level. And now...
Yeah, because it cost a fortune and you had to only go to one of the 3 or 4 TV channels that might carry it.
Or right? companies,
or newspapers or whatever.
JC Deco and Clear Channel for outdoor, sure.
Yeah, but now, of course, you can advertise everywhere. From the poster in your window to, massive Facebook advertising across different nations, right?
And
so
you could do it at a localish level, I think. So if you were, so my family are from Cumbria, right? So in Cumbria, you'd go to maybe the Times and Star and you'd run a press ad there, and you might have some posters in the town. And then, there's a lot of word of mouth and people were on the streets. So your presence counted for a lot. But now it's much harder. Part of that is being driven by how accessible it is to buy advertising on social and digital media. So it's created this very competitive landscape for everyone. And improvements to online shopping and accessibility of that has meant your audience is much more further spread. So you might be running, I like to sew. So say you're running a...
You sound embarrassed by it. You shouldn't be embarrassed about liking to sew. Sewing's a wonderfully pastoral, calm...
cross-stitch swears. It's a form of
fantastic. Can we show some of your cross-stitch swears on the channel, please? That would be excellent.
Yes, we can definitely do that next week.
Good,
It's
excellent.
one I'm particularly proud of.
Good, excellent. I'll take that. Anyway, carry on.
So say you're running a haberdashery type shop in Yorkshire, suddenly your audience isn't just York or the surrounding areas, it's everywhere. It's, people in Scotland and London, and they could be even further afield. So it's meant that suddenly everyone's audiences are broader, there's a lot more access, and so there's a lot more competition for attention.
There is a thing to be said, isn't there, about the smushing between what was local and what is now local.
Yeah.
You only need to see the proliferation of American Instagram reels, for example, to know that, the kind of thing that you just wouldn't have seen 20 years ago, you can see, and you do see every single day now, just because that's what people regard as local, because that's what's on their phone, which is next to them.
Yeah.
And actually, that in itself has changed the nature of not only attention, but the things that we feel are important to us.
Yeah. I mean, I even think the concept of buying British is conflated with buying local, right? I live in London, you live in Salford.
Well, South Manchester, but let's not split hairs. Carry on.
Sorry. It's all north.
It's all the north to you. Okay,
it's not all the north to me.
Let's not get onto this and let's carry on before we have a rant.
Yeah, there's Cumbria and there's everyone else. I used to think south was south of Manchester.
Of course, all of this comes back to how and why these companies are desperate to get eyeballs of one sort or another from all over the globe.
Yeah.
On whatever it is that they're selling, and because it just cements their place in the global marketplace, right?
Yeah, very much. And, the paradox as well is that once you switch on that advertising and it brings in sales, particularly that form of advertising where you're imparting a lot of information and it's short-term sales boost, when you switch it off, it stops, your sales stop. So to keep the sales going, you have to keep it on. But the reality as well is that because there's more competition, and particularly we're heading into Christmas, and in the UK anyway, that period before Christmas, there's a massive increase in ad spend across the board. Yeah. The competition gets fiercer, it's harder to cut through. So we'll see a bit more frantic, behavior from that. But the other side of it as well is that, for companies like Meta and Google, they don't want to turn advertisers off the platform. They don't want to make it feel like it's inaccessible. So they might encourage tweaks to the way that you conduct your advertising. So making it shorter, they might increase the number of ad formats available or the number of ads that you see as a user on Instagram or on Facebook. I remember when Instagram advertising launched, more than 10 years ago now, initially, they said that they would only restrict it to pre-approved advertisers. They wanted it to be really aspirational, and they wanted to make sure that the quality of the advertiser was really strong. You had to have a minimum amount of spend, which was really significant. But now, of course, that's all flipped. Like the majority of that in the US, a lot of that spend is from small and medium enterprises and is done, through the self-service advertising platform that they have. It is the primary way of reaching people, and it seems to be effective for small businesses and driving sales, which is what's important to keep them alive. But from a user standpoint, there's a point at which it's exhausted. And I think if you're Meta, you're constantly trying to figure out how do you get that balance right between, making sure your ad revenue's in check, not driving away advertisers, giving opportunities to advertise on the platform, but at the same time, retaining your users. And I think that is going to get harder and harder to do.
So Claire, so far we have managed to work out how and why these companies are trying to grab and keep our attention. I mean, look, this is an incredibly wide topic, and it is impossible for us to cover all of these things in one go, in one episode. And also, all these things are interlinked, aren't they? We will talk about things in this episode that we'll talk about in 3 episodes' time in a different sector, and that's just the way that this whole topic operates. But what I do want to do is try to give people some sense of hope, because they've been battered around the head for the last few minutes, basically listening to us talk about how and why people are taking their attention. So what can people do to make themselves feel a bit better? So we have like things at the moment, don't we? Like digital detoxing and mindfulness. Is that all just hocus pocus stuff?
I don't think it's hocus pocus at all. I think, mindfulness in particular is a muscle, and you have to practice it. It's easy to get frustrated, but working on that, I think, can help shift it. And also being just a little forgiving of yourself. We wouldn't be doing these things if we didn't enjoy them. I guess it's the same as eating a cupcake, but just think about maybe that way.
I like eating cupcakes. We had Dorman references in the last episode. Let's talk about cupcakes this time. I'm happy either way.
I mean, there's a reason those things are called cookies.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
But, I think there's a couple of things that go hand in hand. So I think, one of the things I think particularly social media has talked about is, concerns about information, media literacy, the value of the information you're getting. And so there's been a really big focus on media literacy, and rightly so, right? Like it's really, really, really important. It's important.
And that's the understanding of where each bit of media is, what they are trying to achieve with that, where their political viewpoints, all of that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, fact checking, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Internet Matters put it this way: there's a postcode lottery in terms of your child's access to that education, but when and where it happens, it is very good. And from their own research, kids in particular are very media literate. They understand it very well. They're very thorough fact checkers, but it's exhausting. The other thing, though, I noticed about them that maybe adults aren't as good at is understanding the attention economy itself, algorithms, and how to modify things to preserve your attention. In particular, sending signals to the algorithm, being very deliberate about that, about what you want to engage with and what you don't. So, if you have teenagers or you have nieces and nephews, friends, kids, talk to them about how they manage their algorithms, have them educate you and how they do that, because it's incredibly valuable information and it will help your ability to process it and also, log off. The other thing that I've seen a lot more of, and is people moving into more private spaces or moving into, things like group chats or actually just in real life, if you can imagine that, the running clubs that are now replacing dating apps, for example, that sort of interaction being that it's a bit more meaningful and less resplendent with advertising and people you don't know. I think that's a savior of people's brains. But the other side of this as well is just having a really good understanding. And I think this is my plea in particular to policymakers, to civil servants, to government, but also to the advertising industry itself. Everyone needs a better understanding and to get a better handle on how this works, how it's changing, and what those changes will mean for people's relationship with media and with communications. And I think in particular, understanding the digital economy and online advertising buying, the ease of access to that, how that affects the algorithm itself and how that affects the flow of information, who is doing it, I think is really, really, really important. Almost more, probably more, than trying to chase the content. It's not really the content that's causing this. It's how easy it is to access dissemination.
One of the things she made me think about then was about the idea that children have got a lot to teach adults about the way that they manage algorithms. And of course, you hear this thing, don't you, all the time about screen time.
Yeah.
That parents are always on about their kids. They're on the screens all the time. This is a really terrible thing. I just made me wonder whether it's the same kind of thing as, kids listening to rock music in the 1950s was going to burden their brains and they should be listening to nice jazz.
Yeah. Everyone thought we'd be broken by MTV, right?
Right. Okay. And some of us were. But it is interesting, isn't it? Is it just, do you think then, do we worry too much about screen time?
Yeah, I think we probably do. worry a little bit too much. For everything I see about screen time, I see a different definition of it. It wasn't as loud when we were growing up, but there were certainly concerns about screen time for us. But a lot of that screen time was being focused on the detrimental effects of television. And there's some good things that came from that, like regulation around advertising to children, I think was one good outcome of that. But a lot of the hype around that we were going to cause, particularly gaming, I think a lot of those fears were potentially overblown, and it missed some of the good stuff that came out of that too. Gaming is, aside from just being really helpful with spatial awareness, also allowed people to imagine different worlds or interact with stories in different ways. It's had a huge impact on the way we do storytelling and music and think about things. Despite gaming being so big, we don't see any of the sort of panic that we saw in the 90s about it, but we see the panic about screens today. And I think it's the sense of the unknown. Looking at these kids and talk to them about, the way that they manage their screen time, I think they actually have a much better handle on it than we do. But their fears and their concerns about what it's doing to them and their social lives. And particularly one of them spoke, on this panel, he didn't want to interact with news content because he was worried it would make him polarized. And that was the word he used, was polarized. Those fears are real. So addressing those fears, having all those conversations with your kids, but also thinking about, okay, right, well, what are the mechanics that make that happen? Because they seem to have a better handle on it than we do. And how do we, as the adults or people with responsibility and in charge of the stuff, interact with that, I think, and incorporate that into our plans is the way forward.
We should definitely do a gaming episode. That's my first thing, because that would be cool. All right, well, let's do that. We'll definitely do that. And then, look, I think we should talk a little bit about what we're going to do in the next episode, all things being equal, because there is a question that needs answering, I think, which is this. Why are we all so tired all the time?
I like that you admitted the swear that I put in the show notes.
I'll be honest, it's just years of doing broadcasting. I just can't.
It was so good. I would not have been able to do that.
There you go. But I think that's a really important question to answer. So we will try and do that next time. Claire, it's been a pleasure as always.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.